Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to Homework 3 Part 1 Bootcamp. Me and Shikar will go through the Part 1 Bootcamp first, and then Sumish and Rucha and other TAs will talk about Homework 3 P2. First of all, some logistics about Homework 3. The early submission is due on October 31st, and for Homework 3 Part 1, you have to get all the 100 marks to get the early submission bonus by the early submission deadline. And on-time submission is due on November 9th, end of the day. So, okay, let's first talk about the structure of an RNN. So if you can see here, an RNN cell, so X is the input and H is the memory. So an RNN cell is basically a recurrent neural network that takes in the previous H and as well as the current input X into and you do some linear transformation and activation on the two inputs and get the current hidden state H. So if you unroll this, you will have you will see a structure like this, and you can think of this recurrent connection as something that's similar to a residual connection that you have used in homework 2P2. It's to help the network to remember what you have learned in the past and not forgetting when you keep on like generating new sequences. So the first part of the homework, it will be to implement an RNN cell forward as well as backward. And here is the equation for RNN cell forward. You can see that this part is doing a linear transformation of the input xt, and this part is doing a linear transformation of the previous hidden state ht minus 1. And basically we want to like combine these two inputs and pass it through an activation function, which is 10h, and get our hidden state for the next time step t. So the equations and how you do the forward and backward would be very similar to the linear function that you implemented for homework 1 part 1. So if you forgot, you can go back and like refer to those. And so some people are curious, why do we use a 10h function in this case instead of other like activation functions like ReLU and stuff? And first of all, the reason we need an activation function here is that we want to introduce some non-linearity in our RNN so that it can compute more like complex content. And the reason that 10h is used instead of ReLU is because 10h is bounded between 1 and -1. So this would prevent the problem of exploding gradient that could potentially be caused by an unbounded activation function like ReLU. So after we implement a single RNN cell, we will want to connect a few of them to make a RNN phoneme classifier. So you can see here, so we have like a few of them. So each of these columns represent a RNN cell. And so this task is a many to one task. So you have you can think of X1 as the MFCC at time step 1 and X2 be the MFCC at time step 2. And you take in a sequence of MFCC, and you want to output one phoneme, which is Y. So this is so the input sequence is passed through a few layers of RNN cells, and the final hidden state here will be passed through a linear layer to give us the phoneme class. So we can think of the final hidden layer state at the final time step as all the features that we extracted from the inputs, and we typically use a linear layer for our final classification layer to transform all those features into logits. So at the end, you will attach a linear layer to get our final output Y. And the second task you will be accomplishing will be the GRU cell forward and backward. This might be a relatively longer task in this homework, or it will probably take you the most amount of time because the whole equation of GRU is very complicated. And if you break it down and have to calculate the backward, there will be more than 20 equations that you have to implement. However, you don't have to be too scared about this. First of all, we can find like some symmetry between our reset gate RT as well as our update CT. So if you look at this carefully, you can see that the structure of the two equations are the same. So and also this whole thing is pretty similar to the RNN cell equation that we just implemented for the first task, except we replaced the 10H activation function with the sigmoid equation. So if you implement one of them, we are pretty much done with the other one. So some people may be curious why we use sigmoid function, activation function here instead of 10H. So one reason is that sigmoid, if you remember, it returns the value from 0 to 1. So so it's useful as a gate in this homework. So for example, if for the R, which is the reset gate, if it has a value that's very close to 0, it means that we will want to forget about the past information. And however, if RT has a value that's very close to 1, it means that we want to remember the past information. So why is this so? So this part you can see is basically a linear combination of the past hidden state. And then if we do an element-wise product of the reset gate with this matrix, then if like R is closer to 0, then the information here the equation here will evaluate to be closer to 0. And whereas if RT is closer to 1, then we are basically maintaining all the memories that we had. So some tips for implementing the backward. So we will suggest that you implement all the DWs and DBs step by step, because although like for the autograder, we will only evaluate the correctness of DX and DH. However, all the intermediate steps are used to calculate the final values of DX and DH. So one very useful resource is this link, how to compute a derivative. In these slides, revisit all the basic rules for like matrix calculus, and as well as it gives you an example of how to calculate the backward equations for LSTM cell, which is equally complicated as the GRU cell that we are trying to implement. So the main takeaway that you should get from this slides is that you want to break down a very complicated function into unary or binary operations. So for example, in these equations, we will first want to, if we want to obtain like the derivative of x, then we first take care of wx plus b, and then we use the z1 to calculate this part of the equation, and then we use z to finally calculate fx. So if you did this step by step, the derivative of like dz1 dx is easy to calculate, and the equations of like dz2 dz1 is easy to calculate. And in the end, you can just chain everything up using chain rule to calculate your final f prime x. So after we implement the GRU cells, we want to use it to do some inference task. So the task that you will be wanting to do is a many-to-many task. So it's a character predictor, which takes in the previous characters and try to predict the next character. So it will have an output at each single time step. So different from the RNN phoneme classifier, here we will want to apply a linear transformation to our hidden states at each time step to predict the character at each time step t. And as also we will want to like record the hidden state of the current time step to fit into the next to calculate the next hidden state during our loop. So now I'll hand to Shikar to talk about CTC and CTC search and other tasks.
Yep, thanks, Chen. I'll just share my screen. And yeah, so the second half of P1 will ask you to implement the CTC loss and the different CTC decoding techniques. So why do we need the CTC loss? So for the sequence-to-sequence model, the input does not always align with the output. Like, for example, if you're doing a machine translation task, there might be like 5 words that go as input, but only 3 words that come out from the outputs. So there's no 1:1 mapping to calculate the loss and to calculate gradients and backpropagate and stuff. So that's why we introduced like CTC loss that allows us to do this. And to calculate the CTC loss, you would require posterior probabilities. And to calculate posterior probabilities, you require the forward and backward probabilities. And the way we calculate these, you will need to like implement the extend target with blank function as well. So in the first half, we will like implement these 5 functions. So let's go over them one by one. So yeah, the first step would be your extend target with blank. For example, you get an input array as b I y f. So you need to return 2 arrays. One would be like the extend symbols, and the other would be skip connections. The extend symbol is basically just an interleaved blank array with like your original array interleaved with blanks and a blank on either extremes as well. And as you studied in the lectures, here there is a possibility of skipping connections that you see here. You don't have to like go over all the connections. And to calculate those, you will implement your forward and backward probabilities, you will need the skip connections array as well. So the rules around skip connections are that they are permitted across a blank, but like only if the symbols on the either sides are different. So for example, when you jump from blank to B, this is the first array would actually show your jump from like a 0 position to blank. So can't be skipped. Blank to B, no. B to blank, blank to IY, IY to blank. So when you go from IY to blank, it can be skipped because there is like on either side there are like the same character. So this is how like your basically your skip connections work, and they can be implemented as given. So next step, we calculate the forward probabilities. Now, what are the forward probabilities? So for example, we first calculate like, so for a given particular point in the complete traversal that we have, we need to find its posterior probability. That is like how likely is this point a part of the final output, like equal to IY. So for that, we first need to calculate the forward probabilities and the backward probabilities. For the forward probability, alpha TR essentially here means that what is the probability that when you're starting your, like, what are the sum of all probabilities that when you're starting the decoding, then at the tth time step, you encounter the symbol equal to IY. So you sum across all the possible scenarios and then you reach alpha TR. So that is how you calculate the forward probabilities, and the actual algorithm that we use with the blank sequences, with the blank arrays that we just saw can be found in the lecture slides, and that should be helpful in like implementing them. So once you have the forward probabilities, now you know how do you come from the start to this point. Now you need to go how now you need to know like how do you go to the end from this particular alpha TR point. So for that, you calculate the backward probability. So the backward probability basically means that given that you are at this step, beta TR, what are all the possible ways to reach the end? That is like IY and 8 here. So you calculate this in a bottom-up fashion, like you calculate it from this, and then you like you calculate from the like bottom right end, and you start moving upwards and reach this particular beta TR point. Again, like you have the formula here, and the code you can like the pseudo code for this you can find in the lecture slides. That should help you like with uh, the homework itself. So now that you have your forward and your backward probabilities, you can finally calculate your posterior probabilities, which is so the posterior probability is essentially a product of the forward and the backward probabilities, and normalized by the like sum of all the probabilities in that time step. So this is again like you can find the pseudocode there in the slides that should help you like implement these. But basically, like now that you look at alpha TR, you can basically tell that what is the probability that you would have reached given that you started from B and 0 to 8 and IY, and what is the like maximum probability, like the sum of all probabilities that you encountered IY at time step 3. So that is like basically your posterior probabilities. And once you have your posterior probabilities, you will be given the logits of the like current output, and you can calculate the divergence based on this formula that you can see on the screen. So on the left, you have to like implement the forward of the loss, and accordingly, once you have like written the forward, you need to implement the backward, like the derivative of the loss. And again, like you can find the pseudocodes in slides. So yeah, like so I'm mentioning the slides again and again. So for the CTC part of your homework D part 1, there's a lot of information that you can directly find in slides. And once you like focus on the lectures properly, you can make your concepts more clear. And apart from this, like next week, we'll be having a recitation for 3P1, where we'll talk about like CTC loss and CTC decoding techniques. So yeah, that's like the first part. Now that you've calculated the CTC loss, you should be able to like in a general like way you should be able to calculate. You should be able to like train your model. But training is fine because you have your test, like you have your input and output pairs, so it's easy to like train. But when you're doing the inference or when you're doing the evals in a real world scenario, you would not have your final outputs ready, right? So you cannot really like use now the outputs or the logics as a reference to calculate the loss. So how do you like how do you calculate the loss in a validation form of sense? So that is where your decoding comes into picture. Basically, because you don't have access to like the truth labels, so there's no way you can calculate the loss because you need access to the truth label. So that is where your decoding, CTC decoding comes into place for your validation. And like even your validation would have outputs, but like for basically your test scenarios and your real world scenarios. So now that you have your final logics ready, there are two techniques basically to perform decoding. One is the greedy search and one is the beam search. I am not sure if Prof has, I think it hasn't been covered until now in class, but if it has, like, again, if you just follow the lecture slides, they'll be very helpful in doing the greedy search and beam search. So let's see, like, so greedy search basically is like, as the name suggests, just picking up the most optimal like the highest max value, given your symbol sets and your logits at each time step. So you just pick it up. You have your final output string, and you follow some compression techniques, which again will be talked in the lecture, to calculate like how your final output looks like, which is and the probability of the final output. So that is there for greedy search. For the beam search, however, like things get a little more complex. And there are two forms of beam search that we generally implement. Over the last semesters, we followed the format that are present in the lecture slides. Those can be a little bit lengthy though, and they're not as intuitive. So at the end of the day, you might be just simply blindly implementing whatever is there in the slides without it making much sense to you. So this semester, we introduced like a new efficient beam search technique that makes a lot more intuitive sense and should be easier to interpret as well. So there is some pseudocode that is there in the slide, it is there in the handout to follow. And on the right, I can just take you over to a small toy case. So you start your beam search, you initialize your best paths with a blank symbol and a score of 1.0. Just your initialization and your 10 best paths as an empty directory. Now that you have these two, for each of the time steps, so here we have like three time steps, T0, T1, T2. You will now get your current logits, like current probabilities, and you will now like like expand your probabilities, like expand your like basically your search. So if you look here, you have minus and one score of one. You go over like the best parts and you extend with all possible scenarios. So you get your temp scores as minus A and B. And your beam width here is k equal to 3. It's not mentioned, like I should have mentioned it here, but yeah, the beam width here is k equal to 3. So all of your temp best paths are able to go into the best path. So this is now your best paths. Now that you have these best paths, you filter out anything that is like, you just pick out the top case scores, which is equal to here, equal to the case here. And then you again expand your like search. So there are basically three cases you will encounter when you are expanding. That the new symbol would be the same as the last symbol on the path. So for example, if you're starting from A and you're sorry, yeah, if you start from A and you reach A again, then there might be that the last symbol of the path is blank. That whenever you're appending this to the search, and it might be the last symbol of the path is different from the new symbol and not the blank. That is like a general case. So these are three cases that you cleverly need to handle. Like it is very intuitive when you study the lecture and you like go over the like I think this handling these three cases is the only typical part in this efficient beam search technique. So now that we look here, we get a sum, like we get multiple like paths here from our starting path. We pick out the top three. We again go and permute over all the possible paths. We get these multiple paths. And since this is like your final step, you stop here, you merge all your paths. There are like merging techniques, which again, Prof will talk about in the lecture. And you pick out your best possible path, which you get as A here, and with the score as 0.1705. So in the beam search again, you will have to return the best path and your all the merge path scores. So it's not just like you do not just have you don't just have to like return your basic path, but also like all the actual paths that are formed across the search. And yeah, like that is about your beam search. This might take a little more time than implementing like CTC because the CTC code is like very like interpretable from the slides. You can just like simply follow that to finish your homeworks. Greedy search is also pretty easy, just that the compression part is a little complex that you might have to handle. Not complex, like a little tricky. And then the beam search is what you'll spend some time on. So yeah, like this is just a visualization of beam search, and if you look at it, it does look like as if you're projecting beams over your search paths. So that is how it gets its name. So yeah, like here we will end the 3P1 bootcamp. If you guys have any questions, you can ask now, or you can like also post it on Piazza on the FAQ part on the Piazza post that follows 3P1. Yeah, so now I'll hand it over to Rucha. She'll continue with 3P2.
Hi everyone, let's get started with homework 3P2 bootcamp. Going over some logistics first. So the early submission for homework 3 part 2 is due on October 31st. And by the early submission deadline, you need to reach a Levenshtein distance of 12 or below, which is the very low cutoff for this homework. Also, please don't forget to complete the quiz on Canvas by the early submission deadline in order to receive the early submission bonus. The on-time deadline for this homework is November 9. Please start working on this homework if you haven't already. And unlike the previous homeworks, there's no parameter limit for this homework. The only constraint here is that you're not allowed to use any attention-based modules. Attention will be used very heavily in the upcoming homeworks. Now that the logistics are out of the way, let's look at the problem at hand. In homework 3 part 2, we return to the topic of speech recognition by predicting phonemes in a recording. You will be dealing with solving a sequence to sequence problem using sequence models. And you will have features like MFCC features, which will be of 28 dimensions like you had in homework 1. And you will pass it to the model to predict the sequence of phonemes. Basically, it's similar to homework 1 part 2, wherein the input is the same as homework 1 part 2, but the labels are different. In homework 1 part 2, labels were order synchronous as well as time synchronous, but that is basically at each timestamp you had the labels provided. But in this homework, you only have the order synchronous knowledge and not the time synchronous knowledge. This has already been covered in class, but just as a quick example of order synchronous but not time synchronous, in this example on the right, you see that you will know that the output will be like B, A, and T, but you would not know at what particular timestamp this output is getting calculated. That is why we'll use CTC loss to help us predict the most probable sequence, and the final metric which will be used for this would be the mean Levenshtein distance. This is also the metric which will determine your rank on Kaggle. So the lower your Levenshtein distance, the higher will be your rank on Kaggle. Moving forward, in homework 1 and homework 2, you had equal length inputs, but in homework 3, the input sequences are of variable length. So basically, your input sequences will be of a variable length, wherein the timestamps of the sequences will be different. When we say variable, it's just basically the time dimensions, and all other features will still be of 28 feature length. So how do we go about handling this? There are two ways, padding and packing. For padding, what we essentially do is we take all the sequences which are lesser than the maximum sequence length and we pad them with zeros. So basically, a batch with any given dimension is converted to B, comma, T, comma, this should be 28, it's not 27. We'll make a correction in the slides because your input size is 28. This is where T is, the T here is the timestamp of maximum length input. One thing to note here is that when you implement this and when we do this padding in the init function, we would be padding on the basis of the entire data set, which means it will take the maximum length of the entire data set, and that will be inefficient with spacing and such very small sequences, which will be padded to the length of the maximum sequence length if you do it in the init function. So to overcome that issue, you should ideally perform padding in batches. The next thing which you need to know here is packing. So what is packing? It is essentially an operation that you need to perform to generate an input which you will provide to the PyTorch LSTMs and any other, like basically all other RNN, LSTM, GRU networks which are provided by PyTorch. So what you see here is there are different elements present here, and these elements represent different MFCC features. In each element, as you can see here, this 0 to 6, this 0 to 6 represents the timestamp dimension. So what we first do here is we sort these in a descending order. So since element 2 has the maximum time length, it comes first, and then it's followed by element 0, element 1, and element 3. And during packing, we take in the 0th timestamp dimension of each and every element. and we concatenate it, and then similarly we'll take the first one and then the second one, and then we'll stack it as you see on the right. So packing will, as you see, packing is basically helping you create a rectangular kind of an input which you would want to pass to your model. So you see that without padding itself, you're able to create that rectangular input for your model. All this is something that you really need to understand. You won't exactly need to implement this because there are functions available in PyTorch which will be handling this for you. But this is important to understand because you should know what is happening under the hood. So these are those functions that I was just talking about, which will help you perform padding and packing. I would highly recommend going through their official documentation to get to know them better. These actually expect like the actual length of the inputs as a parameter in the functions. You'll see that when you check out the official documentation. That is because they should be able to unpack it into the original data. It's an implementation detail you'll get to know as you start with the implementation. But briefly, the way the flow would look like is you will pad the sequence lengths for when you will do batching, and packing and unpacking will be used after that because PyTorch LSTMs require packed input. So whenever you pass your input into your LSTM layers, you will need to pack it, and the output of the LSTM will need to be unpacked if you have to pass it to any further classification layer. So the flow that I was talking about, first you will use like the pad sequence function where you will create your batches. Now this will be done in your collate function, which is present in the starter notebook. This is the first time you'll be writing your own collate function. I believe you have not written this before this homework. And this collate function is the one which is used by data loaders internally to create batches. You can implement your own collate function and provide whatever you need in order to perform the operations that you need to do on the batches explicitly. So these user-defined functions will enable you to do anything and everything on the batches. So it is important to have this in your data loader. Please check the documentation to determine how you would want to pass your collate function in the data loader. So now inside the collate function, you will first do the pad sequencing, which we discussed earlier, wherein we pad the sequences to ensure like equal lengths for batching. Next, we would pack the pad sequences. And as you essentially see in the name itself, this PyTorch function will pack batch of padded sequences. And when you see it, you will note that this function also requires padded input to pack the batch of the padded sequence. And then you will use it just before you pass it to your LSTM layer. It will return the required sentences and also the sequence length, which is very important because you will need it while unpacking. You will pass its output through your LSTM layer, and as soon as you get the output from your LSTM layer, you will unpack back the batch of the padded sequence. So here it's important to understand that you need to keep track of all the sequence lengths and the original sequence length as well, because you will need it while calculating the Levenshtein distance. Moving forward, so this is basically the structure of the entire sequence model, which you will be building here. You will have an embedding layer, a sequence model, and finally a classification layer. We are looking at this embedding layer and the sequence model as the encoder and the classification layer as the decoder part. In this homework, decoder is basically just a simple classification layer, and it's not exactly a decoder in the sense where that everything is in a single block, as you will see in the next homework. So for now, the encoder layer will be the embedding and the sequence model, where sequence models could include anything such as RNNs, LSTM, and bi-LSTMs. And decoder would again just be a simple classification layer. So the encoder is typically used to generate high-level representations of the input data, and the encoder doesn't really have any labels. So you train the entire network, or you train the encoders based on the output of your decoders, and that's backpropped. encoder basically acts as a feature extractor, as you know, and it creates feature representations. So what the decoder does is it's the one, it'll actually make the classification for the problem that you're trying to solve. Moving on, embedding layer is used to increase or decrease the dimensionality of the input. I will now pass it on to Harshit to take it forward from here.
Well, let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, as Rucha was saying, embedding layer is used to just increase the dimensionality of the original input. So in a very simple, yeah, in a very simple example of what embedding layer does in the context of language is that when you give it a sequence of, say, my name is Harshit, then they are basically discrete words as a part of the universal vocabulary that is a part of this task. So each word can be represented as a one-hot vector of this vocabulary. And what the embedding layer basically does is convert these one-hot vectors or these discrete words into continuous representations. So since here all these words are discrete, you can have an embeddings matrix where each row corresponds to one word in the vocabulary, and you can just do a matrix row lookup or a matrix multiplication with the one hot vector to get the embeddings. So in the context of language, it's really like a one matrix multiplication operation, which will give you the embeddings for every word. However, in our case, the input is not discrete words. It is vectors of length 28, and these are continuous inputs at each time step, right? So what we do here is we cannot really do a matrix lookup of some embeddings matrix or something like that. So instead, we use CNNs. We use 1D CNNs, which are time-delayed neural networks, as you have learned when you were learning about convolutional neural networks. We use 1D CNNs to basically upsample the channels from 28. This should be 28 in the figure, not 27, to some higher number of features. So consider a very simple example where you have three features. In our case, you have 28, but consider a very simple example where you have three features and you have like 7 time steps. You can increase that to 5 features by using a convolutional neural network, having 5 sets of filters. And there can be different settings of kernels and paddings and strides that you can experiment with. Typically, what people like to do is keep a stride of 1 with some padding so that the length of the sequence does not change in the embedding layer. Only the number of channels increase or the number of features, but it's entirely up to you. You can also have a strided convolution here to downsample the time length of the sequence while also increasing the features. It's entirely up to you and you can experiment with that. So this is what people typically use for embedding layer here. So yeah, these are the two things that I was saying. Either you have to increase the number of channels in most cases, but you can also increase the spatial dimension by having strided convolution. There's one small implementation detail here. So the batches that you will be getting, as which I was saying, you do some padding in the collate function, which means the collate function returns the batch, does some operations on the batch before returning it. So the batches that you will be getting would be B cross T cross 28, where B is the batch size, T is the maximum time length in that batch, and 28 is the number of features. Now, when you apply 1D CNNs, if you remember from homework 2, CNNs expect channel to be the second dimension and not the last dimension. Here, 28 is the last dimension. So before you apply the CNN in the embedding layer, you first transpose the first and second dimension to make it B cross 28 cross time, then apply the channel, and then apply the 1D CNN or the 1D CNNs, if you may. And then you transpose it back again before you do the packing and passing it to sequence model. Because when you pack the sequence, it again expects the number of channels or the number of features to be the last dimension. So there's slight mismatch between what the packing operation expects and what 1D CNNs expect. So you need to take care of the dimensions along the way. So yeah, this is again illustrating that you can do strided convolution as well to decrease the time steps, but do not do this with a very big stride. Otherwise, you will lose a lot of temporal information. So typically people use like a stride of 1 or stride of 2 or things like that, but don't go for a very big stride. Also, so when you return something from the batch, you not only get the MFCCs and the labels, but also the lengths, because every time step has an actual true length. So you get the lengths as well from the collate operation. Uh, what you have to do is that in case you are doing a strided convolution, you also need to change the length before passing it through the sequence models. So for example, you have a batch of size 4 with length 2, 6, 10, and 10. You will get not only the MFCCs, but also a list of these lengths, which is 2, 6, 10, and 10. If you apply a convolution which does not change the lengths of the inputs in the embedding layer, that's completely fine. But if you do apply a strided convolution, make sure that you change the lengths as well according to the final lengths of your convolutions out. Is there any doubt up till now as to what the embeddings layer is doing, the convolution layers and the embeddings are doing? Okay, I'll take that as a no and move ahead. So I just spoke about like 1D convolution layers. So what people normally do is have 2 or 3 1D convolution layers, or have it as a pattern of conv batch norm relu and conv batch norm relu or something like that, 2 or 3 convolution layers. But you can also have the convolution layers with a residual connection, just like you created resonets in homework 2. This is another thing that you can experiment with, which will just enable you to relay information better through the embeddings. So once you have the embedding layer, you will ideally have an input of size B cross T cross some higher number of channels, for example, B cross T cross 64 instead of B cross T cross 28. And finally, you are ready to pass it through the sequence model. So now what you have at hand is a padded sequence. Sequence models like LSTMs and RNNs, they expect packed sequence. So first you will pass it through the pack padded sequence method, uh, which you can read the documentation of with the correct parameters, of course. Just look at the parameters. There are parameters like, is your batch the first dimension or the second dimension? Do you want to sort it or not? And things like that. But yeah, for any of these sequence models, you first have to pack your padded sequence, then send it through an LSTM or GRU or RNN. We normally recommend LSTM for this homework. Uh, and of course, LSTM has its own number of own parameters that you can tweak. So you can have some dropout, you can have different number of layers of LSTMs, you can have different hidden sizes, and you can also make it a bidirectional LSTM, in which case the output will have 2 times the hidden dimension number of channels. These are all simple hyperparameters that you must have realized by now that you have to tweak a lot. So yeah, play around with these things. But LSTMs will be are expected to be the general framework of your sequence layers. There is a slight variation of the LSTM, which is called a pyramidal bidirectional LSTM. Uh, it is mostly a simple LSTM, except a pre-operation, which happens before you actually apply the LSTM. What we do is we basically take adjacent time steps and concatenate their channels. So in a sense, we double the dimensionality and we downsample the time length by 2. So just illustrating what that means is, so if you have an input to the LSTM which has 3 channels and 8 time steps, you'll take adjacent time steps, concatenate them to each other, which will result in uh, a modified input of 6 channels and 4 time steps, and then you feed it through your by LSTM layer. If the hidden size is 5, since it's by LSTM, you will get an output of 10 channels or 10 hidden units. This is what pyramidal bi-LSTM is. The concatenation part is what is extra, except the bi-LSTM. One small implementation detail that you'll have to take care of is that if the input has an odd number of time steps, you need to decide what you want to do with the extra time step. Either you can pad an extra time step or you can remove the last time step. It's up to you. One more thing that you need to keep in mind here is that You just need to take care of the lengths even here because the lengths get altered. But since it's a packed sequence, you probably won't have to do that. When you unpack it, you will get the final lengths back. So like the pseudocode looks very similar to like a simple BiLSTM, except this one pre-step where you reshape your original input to half the length, half the number of time steps, and twice the dimensionality. So a simple reshape operation will help you do that. And I'd encourage you to think about why a simple reshape operation can do this, and you don't need to do some complex transpositions and stuff like that. So yeah, this is what the P/LSTM is. At this stage, I'll hand over to Sumesh to talk about the decoder block. Before that, are there any other questions? Sumesh, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just share the screen once. Yeah, can you guys see the screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, good. So for the classification layer, we can basically use an MLP, and this is the output which we get from the sequence model, which is basically our RNN, LSTM, or GRU. So this will be similar to what you have implemented in your homework 1P2. We'll be using a couple of linear layers. We don't want, you can get off from this homework by using a couple of linear layers. It's not necessary. You need to bring in a deep network. You can still experiment with like the width, the number of layers, the activation in between them, and some dropouts if you see any overfitting. And you can also use substral normalization in the data, or you can also use batch norm. So I believe you might have implemented this in homework 1 part 2 as well. You can also experiment with the weight decays in your optimizer and the weight initialization for your convolution layers or the linear layers. And in terms of scheduler to train the whole network, you can use reduce LR. This mostly works for this homework. You can also experiment with cosine annealing, but if you want first choice for your experiments, I would suggest going with reduce LR on plateau. And it has been observed like the Levitstein distance kind of oscillates at a very lower learning rate. So you can experiment with the number of time steps or the patience value for your reduce LR on plateau. So there dropout can definitely help you in the overfitting case. So you can use dropouts in all three parts of your model, which is embedding sequence, and the classification part of your model. Start off with the small dropouts and then observe how the model is getting trained, and then you can increase the dropout rate. So there is something called a log dropout. If you go through the starter notebook, we have given a link, and you can go through the link for implementing this log dropout. And this is usually used with the LSTM layers. If you need to make sure that the dimensions are changed accordingly while you use the log dropout. So make sure you go through the link that has been provided and follow the comments which are given in that in the documentation. You for other kinds of regularization on your data itself, you can add some noise to the data. Like you can add a random Gaussian noise and gumble noise. This should be uh, this should be one of your last options for regularization. You can experiment with other stuff which I mentioned before, and time masking and frequency masking also helps in this homework. So basically, it's like masking along. So you can divide your MFCC. Your MFCC is being represented along frequency domain, which is your y-axis, and time domain, which is your x-axis. And time masking is basically like bringing a vertical mask, and frequency masking is just bringing a horizontal mask on your MFCCs. So this is like making sure your model doesn't overfit to these the training data, and they can generalize more on your test data as well. So for beam width, you can use higher beam width on your testing period, but it is suggested like you can keep it below 50, because if you keep higher beam width, then it takes a lot of computation. Sometimes even beam width of 1 also, which is basically a greedy search, can also give you good results. And it is not suggested like you use high beam width for while validating, because again, you'll be using a lot of compute and you might be wasting some time during validation. Final tip, please make sure you coordinate well with your study group, and this can make your life easier. Yeah, that's all I have from myself. All the best. Good luck with your homework.
Just to add one more thing. So about the time masking and frequency masking, there are two places you can do that. You can either do that in the collate function, where you actually return the batches. So you can do the masking there and then and return the batches, or you can do this as a part of your model class. So for those of you who did augmentations in homework one, you'll probably remember that there are these two places where you can do that. But in homework one, we were doing it in the model class. But here you can do that in the model class or in the collate function, because here we are doing some custom operations before returning the batch. So the masking can be a part of those custom operations. And also the log dropout link that is given in the notebook. There is one more link which is given here in the slides. You should read the one in the slides to understand that the code works for which kind of arrangement. Does it work for batch first, or does it work for time steps first as the first dimension? I'm sorry. So just make sure that you understand that and code log dropout accordingly.
I'm assuming there is there any doubts?